Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the American Academy. My name is Christine Wallach, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm a trustee here at the American Academy. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's Airbus lecture on quantum leaps in European integration, given by our distinguished visitor, Barry Eichengreen. It's a special honor to introduce Barry this evening. We've known each other since when we were graduate students together at Yale University in the economics department in 1974. I think you can count how many years ago that was. His research took him in the direction of economic history and macroeconomics, mine in the direction of governance, anti-corruption, and economic development. It was quite a class. One of us became president of Mexico, another became finance minister of Brazil, and another revolutionized endowment investing with his very novel theory that illiquid stocks are a better investment than liquid ones, and tripled the value of Yale's endowment. It goes without saying that Barry belongs to this group of stars, and his list of achievements, awards, and honors is very long. He's taught at Berkeley as Distinguished Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science since 1987. He's a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. He's advised the International Monetary Fund, is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and has received fellowships from Guggenheim and Fulbright Foundations, among others. And if that weren't enough, other accolades include Distinguished Teaching Awards, an honorary doctorate from the American University in Paris, the 2010 Schumpeter Prize, and being named one of Foreign Policy magazine's 100 leading global thinkers. Barry's the author or co-author of nearly a dozen books, most recently In Defense of Public Debt, which argues that the capacity to issue debt throughout history has been integral to state building and state survival and to modern economic growth, relevant topic for this evening. Other books include The Populist Temptation, Economic Grievance and Political Reaction in the Modern Era, and How Global Currencies Work, Past, Present, and Future. Barry's, of course, a researcher par excellence, but what really distinguishes his work is its policy relevance, which brings me to tonight's talk. Barry's been working on European integration, mainly European monetary integration, since 1990. That's to say, a very long time. There's no real precedent in history for European monetary union, so in addressing today's challenges, policymakers don't really have the benefit of experience or past experiments. It's really uncharted waters that are being trod in. We do have lessons, though, from past oil shocks and the more recent financial crisis regarding the political and economic perils of ignoring economic fallouts of crises on society and the vulnerable. A key aspect of the current crisis, the Russian attack on Ukraine, that distinguishes it from the 2008 financial crisis is that all European countries, perhaps excepting Norway, are adversely affected. Germany is amongst the most vulnerable. However, while it's a shared European predicament, individual countries face very different capabilities to address it. Yet if weaker countries are abandoned, the political consequences, populism, etc., in the neighborhood would be dire. Tonight, Barry's going to discuss the EU's choices and options, including a quantum leap towards deeper integration. Before handing over to Barry, a quick word about Zoom. If you're joining us via Zoom and would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A section on the Zoom page, and we'll pass that on to Barry. Barry, thanks so much for coming back to the Academy a second time and being with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. It's a special pleasure to be introduced by my classmate, Christine, and to be at the Academy. I think we have too few of these institutions that go beyond national interests in this age of nationalism. I'm aware that this is the Airbus lecture, as well. So that's a suitable umbrella under which to talk about Franco-German cooperation or European integration, which is my topic tonight. I'm not going to talk about my book, In Defense of Public Debt. That would be too provocative, I think, given the setting. So let me start with a question, the question implicitly posed by the title of the talk. Is Europe at another one of those critical junctures where it must choose between the status quo and a quantum leap toward deeper integration? We've seen such leaps before, for example, with the creation of the single market in 1986, with the move to banking union and the European stability mechanism, the EU bailout fund, for those of you who are not technically inclined in that direction, in 2012, and with the agreement to create 860 billion euro recovery and resilience facility, NextGenerationEU, in other words, in response to the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. These were all, in my estimation, significant departures from the status quo. They were all meaningful steps in the direction of deeper integration, permanent steps in the direction of deeper integration. We can come back to that. But the question I want to pose now, and that I'll address in the conclusion of my talk, is whether Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with its far-reaching implications for European security, energy, and economic policies, will prompt a similar reaction and another quantum leap in the direction of deeper European integration. So at this point, it's customary to invoke Jean Monnet's theory of European integration, the theory of the father of European integration, if you will, namely, quote, Europe will be forged in crises and will be the sum of the solutions adopted for those crises. By this interpretation, the single market in 1986 was a response to crises of financial instability, notably in France, and chronic high unemployment Europe-wide. Banking union in 2012 was a response to the euro crisis of 2009-2010, and NextGenerationEU was a response to the economic and public health emergency of the pandemic. Given the acute nature of the crisis in Ukraine and its far-reaching, even dire geopolitical implications, Monnet's theory suggests that we may be about to see another quantum leap forward in European integration. Having said that, not all quantum leaps in European integration have occurred in response to crises. So the Treaty of Rome in 1957, which established the European Economic Community and led within a decade to the creation of the customs union, did not occur in a climate of immediate crisis, or so I would argue. The Maastricht Treaty was negotiated in a period of relative financial stability. It was, in fact, followed by a crisis rather than precipitated, negotiated in response to a financial crisis. And some first-order crises, such as the oil shocks, inflation, economic and financial turbulence, and unemployment of the 1970s, did not occasion quantum leaps. To the contrary, the literature on European integration refers to the 1970s as the doldrums era, or the dark age of European integration, because of its lack of progress. To my mind, these observations are a reminder that Monnet's theory is underspecified. Something must be added. Adding starts, I think, by distinguishing different social scientific approaches to analyzing European integration, where it's conventional to distinguish three: the functional, the intergovernmental, and the institutional. Functionalists see regional integration as occurring where increasing returns and cross-border spillovers are important, where there is an efficiency argument for integration and policy at the European level. So where increasing returns and cross-border spillovers are prevalent, transferring national functions to a transnational agency or creating an administrative entity to coordinate national policies will enhance efficiency. And where integration along these lines is efficiency enhancing, there will be pressure for such integration to take place, or so functionalists form follows function, if you will. It is argued. It's said that the modern father of functionalism in the European context was none other than Jean Monnet. Monnet saw the efforts of governments to rebuild their national steel industries after World War II as an instance where there were important externalities and cross-border spillovers. So he worried, for example, that uncoordinated national policies would bequeath excess capacity in the European iron and steel industry. He also conjectured that the new bureaucratic entity, the European Coal and Steel Community, could expand to other areas once it had demonstrated its competence. Intergovernmentalists, in contrast, see regional integration as the outcome of self-interested bargaining between governments, each with its own distinctive national interests and different degrees of leverage. Neo-functionalists, following my late great Berkeley colleague, Ernie Haas, suggested that the initial steps toward European integration might lead to a reconfiguration of interests that cut across national lines, that cut across national borders. Intergovernmentalists, in contrast, intergovernmentalists such as Harvard's Stanley Hoffman, suggested that differences in national interests, identities, and policy preferences would endure. Looking at Europe's political landscape at the moment suggests that Hoffman may have been onto something. So from that point of view, it follows that integration could only result from hard bargaining between states and from mutually advantageous policy trade-offs and packages. The third approach to European integration foregrounds institutions. Institutionalists, I think of my Berkeley colleague Paul Pearson, emphasized the importance of institutional design in channeling and constraining the energies of governments and interest groups. One version is rational choice institutionalism, building on the rational choice literature in American politics in particular. This focuses on how design choices can lead to determinate outcomes of otherwise indeterminate processes, and how self-interested agents, aware of those consequences, go about choosing among designs. So examples here include the choice between unanimity voting in Europe on most areas of single market legislation, for example, versus qualified majority voting on other matters considered by the Council of Ministers. Another example would be the agenda-setting power of the European Commission. More generally, the powers vested in and the decision-making procedures adopted by the Council, by the Commission, and by the Court of Justice can be seen as responses to the economist's incomplete contracting problem, the difficulty of anticipating all contingencies, responses that involve giving these entities the power to interpret and apply incompletely specified agreements. That's rational choice institutionalism. Historical institutionalism, in contrast, places institutional choices in their historical context where institutions once put in place evolve in path-dependent ways. EU institutions once created take on a life of their own, if you will. Historical institutionalists argue that European integration as a historical process doesn't run in reverse. Thus, creation of the customs union and the single market by providing incentives for firms to specialize further and restructure along export-oriented lines created micro-level constituencies with interests in maintaining and even deepening those forms of integration. Not only the customs union and the single market, but other aspects of European integration, the single currency, for example, appear to display that kind of path-dependent irreversibility. So I strongly believe that to be the case of the euro. Popular arguments for how Europe would be better off with a Northern European euro and a Southern European euro, or without certain weak currency members, simply are not on because of the historical path-dependent nature of the process. This kind of historical institutionalism gives us at least some hope for understanding and explaining the quantum leaps in European integration that are the subject of my talk. Historical institutionalists suggest that when exogenous pressures become overwhelming, a critical period or juncture can open, which allows significant institutional changes to take place. They speak of punctuated equilibria, in which long periods of institutional stability or only very gradual institutional change are interrupted by exceptional episodes of rapid radical change, giving rise subsequently to a new stable institutional equilibrium. These, if you will, periods of rapid change are often precipitated by crises that cause what sociologists refer to as collective stress, and that collective stress unfreezes deep-seated perceptions of a well-functioning status quo, opening the door to radical change. That sequence bears a family resemblance to my quantum leaps, if you will. But again, I think the theory, such as it is underspecified. To what level must exogenous pressures rise exactly before they become overwhelming and create a critical juncture? Is it simply the intensity of exogenous pressures that create the critical juncture, or the intensity of those pressures combined with other aspects of the underlying environment? And when a critical juncture does arise, what determines whether the decision makers take the branch that leads to significantly deeper integration instead of the branch leading to the reverse? I find an answer to those questions, at least in part, in the work of political sociologists who've long pondered those questions. They define a crisis as a situation when policymakers perceive a threat to the core values and life-sustaining functions of a political and social system, requiring urgent remedial action if that system is to survive. Often that threat arises under conditions of imperfect information and high uncertainty about the exact nature of the threat and about appropriate remedial action. I think that perspective is helpful. Adopting this definition lends a bit of additional specificity to the issue. Policymakers seeking to advance, or for that matter to resist reform, then must apply a frame or an interpretation to events, to the crisis with which they're confronted. Put another way, put the way economists think about such things, facts require a model in order to be interpretable, and a frame or interpretation, a model, is arrived at by following a socially accepted script. Political sociologists distinguish three types of scripts, at least the political sociologists whose work I follow. The first one is the crisis learning adaptation script, where the crisis prompts an effort to learn from the failures that gave rise to the crisis, the lessons drawn about the shortcomings of earlier arrangements giving rise to the crisis, then guide agreement on subsequent reform. Typically, those reforms are managed by professionals, by technocrats, if you will, who organize and contribute to the process of evaluation and lesson drawing. One can see the operation of this script in the evaluation exercises and reports of the European Commission, for example. Second, post-crisis change can be understood as the outcome of a political blame game script. Stakeholders blame the crisis on specific participants displaying specific weaknesses. Agreement on the assignment of blame gives rise to a consensus around the need for institutional reforms to prevent those exhibiting such weaknesses from, again, destabilizing the system in the future. Political sociologists suggest that the blame game reform, the crisis blame reform script will be adopted by powerful players or critical participants in the institutional arrangement. It will be adopted when there exist clear asymmetries in the impact of the crisis, and when the system's survival depends on a contribution from more powerful, less impacted players. One can see the German government and others reading from this script when they blamed the Greek government or the Greek people or Greek political culture for destabilizing the euro area, and when they then called for strengthened fiscal procedures and no bailout rules and new institutions like the European Stability Mechanism to prevent the same thing from happening again and threatening the system. Third, post-crisis change can be directed by incumbent forces reading from a crisis aggrandizement reform script. Incumbents exploit the crisis by arguing that meeting it requires further centralization of power or temporary removal of institutional constraints that militate against radical action. So this is the script that I find most difficult to apply in the European context, but people have applied it. One can see an example of this script when the European Central Bank is accused of responding to the euro crisis by adopting a program of outright monetary transactions over the objections of German litigants who saw this as an unauthorized extension of its monetary powers. So how far can these observations take us toward understanding the three quantum leaps that I referred to in my introduction: the single market, the banking union and European Stability Mechanism, and NextGenerationEU? Let me start with the single market. The background to the single market negotiations, namely the first half of the 1980s, was a crisis in two senses. First, it was a crisis for France, which tried to reflate unilaterally after the unemployment of the 1970s, and starting in 1981, experienced two painful, embarrassing, involuntary devaluations of the franc, and was threatened by a third. Second, in the early 1980s, there was the crisis of high European unemployment, which afflicted France in particular, but the entire continent. Unemployment in Europe was consistently above 8% for the first time in the post-World War II period in 1981, and unemployment in Europe peaked in 1985, 1986, precisely coincident with agreement to go ahead with the single market. Chronic unemployment was seen as part of a larger economic malaise in Europe. When I go to my favorite source, which is Google's Ngram Viewer, which is basically a compendium of references in all books written in English on all subjects, it shows that references to the term Eurosclerosis take off from virtually zero starting in 1981 and reach a high level in the mid-1980s. So given France's failed experiment, France's inability to go it alone, it didn't seem that standard remedies at the national level were capable of addressing these problems. So the perception was that radical measures were needed to bring unemployment down. At stake was whether countries would adopt those measures unilaterally, as France had attempted previously, or whether European countries would pull together, if you will. Equivalently, the question was whether that crisis would be an occasion for European integration to leap forward or fall back. As I read the history, as late as early 1983, the outcome was finally balanced, at which point François Mitterrand, a lifelong Europeanist, opted for the European solution. So that statement, that sentence, is a reminder that any theory of European integration should admit a role for individuals, for leaders and their ideologies. It should admit a role for historical contingency, in other words, as historical institutionalists would stress. And the subsequent response, the subsequent solution, took the form of the Single Market Act, which incorporated exactly 279 proposals for deeper European integration, authored by the European Commission in a white paper issued in 1985. Those proposals were designed, as you know, to create a Europe free of internal frontiers and a more flexible, efficient, and dynamic economy following the Commission's neoliberal vision. The Commission's white paper gave Mitterrand and other advocates of deeper integration a platform on which to stand. The importance of that document is consistent, I think, with the crisis learning adaptation script and with its emphasis on technocrats in framing lessons and recommending adaptations. Historical institutionalists would emphasize the development of the Commission over a period of decades and its acquisition of the administrative capacity to author and issue a white paper with 279 specific proposals, effectively setting the agenda for European reform and integration. At the same time, the leap forward to the single market is consistent with the neo-functionalist theory, insofar as the customs union and related steps had created a transnational business coalition pushing for market liberalization and integration. So that's my story about the response to the crisis of the 1980s and the advent of the single market. Turning to the euro crisis, that fanned doubts about the stability of European banks with large positions in their own and other governments' debts whose sustainability was now in question. The Greek dimension of the crisis raised fears that the country might be forced to abandon the euro by a combination of capital flight and Great Depression-like unemployment. In that instance, we can see participants reading from all three crisis scripts, I think. Germans recited the blame game script. They blamed profligate Greeks and their spendthrift government for the crisis. German leaders, therefore, supported creation of the European Stability Mechanism, whose founding director was and is a German bureaucrat to ensure that any future financial rescues for countries in similar positions would be subject to restrictive conditions. Officials of various EU institutions employed the crisis learning reform script. They sought to identify flaws in macroeconomic and financial policies and to recommend corrective action. Their recommended corrective action was banking union to internalize the cross-border spillovers of inadequate national bank regulation. And banking union gave one of Europe's key institutions, the ECB, regulatory oversight of Europe's big banks, and as such was a significant step toward deeper European integration. So I think my different approaches to understanding European integration shed at least some light on how these reform decisions were reached. Functionalist theory suggests that as capital controls and exchange rate risk were removed, capital controls by the Single European Act, exchange rate risk by the Monetary Union, the cross-border spillovers and externalities from purely national banking and financial regulation became too powerful to ignore. In other words, the functionalist argument for banking union to complement monetary union and economic union became irresistible. Related is the neo-functionalist argument that integration in one domain, in this case monetary integration, that eliminates exchange rate risk and capital controls, itself creates pressure, maybe unanticipated pressure for integration in other domains, namely bank regulation. And intergovernmentalists would emphasize that member states could agree on banking union because they had all suffered from banking problems to a degree, and their interests were therefore aligned. Third and finally, COVID-19 and NextGenerationEU. I think the EU response in 2020 was unimaginable previously. Quick agreement on a significant, if possibly one-time, common fiscal capacity in the form of those 860 billion euros of bonds to be issued by the European Union as opposed to the member states. EU leaders could read from the crisis learning adaptation script. The Commission produced estimates of the costs of responding to both the health and economic emergencies, thereby informing and structuring policy discussions. It helped that the blame game script was not applicable in 2020. The crisis had been exported to the EU from outside its borders, and all member states suffered from its impact. So distributional aspects of the response were not as prominent as at other junctures. Functionalist arguments would have predicted an EU response along these lines. Containing the virus requires ideally coordinating the response across countries, given the ability of infection to spread across borders. The neo-functionalist variant would point to the need to coordinate that response in order to preserve the single market, to avoid the need for even more extended border closures that might have jeopardized economic and commercial integration. Liberal intergovernmentalists focus on the Franco-German alliance that pushed for grants in addition to loans in an important joint position paper in, I believe it was the summer of 2020, which helped to set the agenda for negotiations. French governments had long advocated fiscal activism at the EU level, so the notable change in the summer of 2020 was in the attitude of the German government, traditionally an advocate of fiscal restraint. Berlin worried, as I read it, that spread of the virus could force border closures that would be severely damaging to German export industry. In addition, it feared that failure to respond forcefully would damage the legitimacy of the EU as an institution, legitimacy that had already been dented as a result of the controversies over the response to the Greek and Euro crises. In concluding, let me return to my opening question, namely, will the multiple crises caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine precipitate another quantum leap in European integration? So it's clear here all I can do is speculate, but forecasting is hard, especially when it involves the future. There are some grounds, I think, though, for a positive answer. Politicians are reading from the crisis learning reform script, not the blame game script. They're not blaming one another for the current crisis as much as they are blaming an outside entity, Russia. European governments have learned or are relearning the need to attend to Europe's collective security. In principle, of course, the EU already possesses a common foreign policy, a spokesman in the form of the High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy, and a Commissioner for External Relations. But in practice, the common foreign policy focuses mainly on trade relations, counterterrorism, trade relations with the rest of the world, counterterrorism, peacekeeping, sanctions against human rights violators. Decisions regarding the common foreign and security policy must be adopted by the Council by unanimous consent. So this limited domain for the common foreign and security policy and the unanimity rule are obstacles to a leap forward in European integration. They are obstacles to the emergence of a more forceful EU foreign policy. Functionalists would argue that member states have traditionally differed in their policy preferences and that diversity of preferences dominated any advantages of pooling of resources, any advantages of increasing returns when the question arose of whether to shift additional foreign policy functions up to the level of the EU. Now, however, perhaps Russia's invasion of Ukraine has accentuated those increasing returns, has highlighted the value of a common foreign policy response. In addition, Russia's attack may lead some national leaders and their constituents to rethink those previous positions. Certain Central European politicians previously sympathetic to the Russian regime may move closer to Western European member states. In addition to the diversity of preferences mattering less because having a common foreign policy is now more important, the diversity of preferences may actually be less going forward. A significant indicator would be if EU treaties were revised to increase scope for qualified majority voting on foreign and security policy matters. So as I understand it, that's really what Emmanuel Macron proposed in a speech in May. Olaf Scholz said something similar, if vaguer, in his speech in Prague last month, although I think to be precise, he proposed this qualified majority voting for sanctions policy toward human rights violations and taxation, not military action. The European Commission proposed something similar back in 2019 for taxation as well. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether this idea, this time coming from the Franco-German motor that traditionally drives European integration, now gains more traction. Historically, you will know Germany has resisted institutional reforms, promising a more forceful European foreign policy. So it will be important to see whether we now observe a turning point, Scholz's term in Prague. Historically, small member states like those of the Baltics have resisted qualified majority voting. Now that they're on the front lines of the EU's conflict with Russia, it's possible that they will change their tune. In addition, the EU faces the challenge, you will well know, of reconfiguring its energy system in order to shift away from Russian gas, shift toward other sources of oil and gas, further accelerate the green transition toward renewables and possibly nuclear energy. The costs of doing that will be borne unevenly across member states, creating an argument for another one-time EU fiscal capacity. From this point of view, it's a bit unnerving, at least to me, that there hasn't been more talk about another EU bond issuance to help countries in a poor position to do so, to finance that transition. And it's further unnerving that the one-time 850 billion euro bond issuance resources from 2020 have only 15% of them have been dispersed to date. In any case, an efficient energy transition will require more closely integrating national energy networks, given the location, the very uneven location across the Union of ports, storage facilities, and generation capacity. If history is a guide, this is where the next quantum leap in European integration will start. That's my guess, with additional economic energy market integration rather than defense cooperation or political integration. But from economic and energy market integration, the process could eventually spill over to those other domains. After all, that's what Jean Monnet, as a good neo-functionalist, thought would follow from the creation of the European coal and steel community. First and foremost, an economic endeavor that might spill over to other domains in the event Monnet was right. So let me stop there. Thank you for the attention. So I have a couple of questions here. If I'm happy to take them from the audience as well. Yes.
Thanks for your analysis, in-depth view of history and current events or closely related events in the European integration process. As a banker and lawyer as well, I would honestly try to tackle the topic from a different angle. Given all those details on issues where integration only went mosaic key or mosaic stone by stone forward, isn't it time to revert rather to a process that just got the Stance Commission initiated prior to the plebiscite that went wrong in Europe, but focus on a constitutionalized process as to whether or not it is a question of quality jump with regard to statehood that is required in order to tackle the many challenges that Europe faces as a whole, as a community. As long as you have so many cooks in the kitchen, you won't come to terms, or simply only millimeter-wise, probably. And this is probably the lesson behind Macron's and Scholz's perhaps analysis as well. Would you regard such a constitutional, supranational constitutional process, summoning potentially such an assembly as forward-looking solution potential for Europe, even if only related to the willing nations? Thanks.
So if I understood the question, you're asking whether a full-fledged European Constitutional Convention would be a path forward. And I think my answer would be that 50-plus years of European integration suggest that the answer is no, that Europe proceeds from, European integration proceeds through incremental changes that, if designed well or for unintended reasons sometimes, lend additional momentum to the integration process. And there would be more resistance than appetite for a European Constitutional Convention. There would be great worries about what would come out of that Pandora's box if you opened it. So you may be aware that there is a movement afoot from right-wing forces in the United States to have a new constitutional convention in the U.S. as well. And I would have the same Pandora's box fears about what would come out. Yes. So I apologize for not being able to call people by name. But.
It's all right. I am surprised that although you came to your conclusion about the political dimensions of everything that's going on, you didn't mention with one word the fall of the Berlin Wall and everything that occurred around that for the European Union and for everything that happened. I think that it's such an important political event that you cannot ignore it. And I don't think it's possible to think about everything that's going on now without going back to 1989, the lead up to 1989, and what followed from 1989. Thank you.
So absolutely. If I was giving a longer lecture on additional aspects of the European integration process, I would emphasize the the fall of the wall and German reunification, the implications of that for the European monetary system, which were negative in the event, but in term the additional momentum that stress gave for the creation of the euro. So I would not argue, and the expansion of the European Union with both, which created both additional opportunities and additional complications. Absolutely. So this is a rich and varied history, all aspects of which I couldn't touch on in 40 minutes.
My name is Daniel Bosenius. I absolutely agree that the key European reform would be more majority voting on financial questions, foreign policy, and even defense. And I also think that Germany and France could agree on some kind of such a reform, and some other Western European countries would agree too. And I personally hope that it would happen, but I'm very skeptical, and I want to briefly explain why. I think some of the Eastern European countries are not going to play along, particularly Poland, and also a country like Czech Republic. I think when Chancellor Scholz gave his speech in Prague, the Czech Prime Minister didn't even attend the speech. I think he introduced him and then he left. And this was a pretty strong statement, I think. But I think Poland is even more difficult. I think the economic historian Adam Tooze, who recently spoke in Berlin, he made the same argument. And I think that the Russian attack on Ukraine is not an incentive strong enough, I think, to convince Poland to do so, because I think Putin proved with the invasion how weak the Russian military is. And I think so far, the Biden administration has been pretty competent in supporting Ukraine. I mean, the main supporter of Ukraine is the US, and not the European Union is important too, but the main supporter is the United States, particularly when it comes to arms supplies and intelligence support. And so I think as long, and I don't hope for that. I mean, unless we don't get another president in the United States who doesn't care about NATO, I don't see Poland at the moment to agree to such a reform in the other European, in the other Eastern European, some other Eastern European countries. Thank you.
So your question, in a way, relates to the previous one about the fall of the wall and the resulting expansion of the European Union, that it is necessarily more difficult in a larger and more diverse EU for the Franco-German motor to drive the integration process forward. So that observation clearly holds a lot of water. At the same time, I'm far from convinced that Polish leaders and the Polish people have been reassured by the events of 2022, that they now feel more secure because they see the German military as weak. I haven't been to Poland in a while, but that's not an obvious reading of the situation there from what I do read. And it could be that countries from Poland to the Baltics, while they have other interests as well, have a strong interest in a common European foreign and security policy, and that they can be brought on board with that if other differences with the EU can be overlooked.
Very much. Christian Kalis from Free University, Berlin. I have a question regarding the neo-functionalist approach, the Jean Monnet approach you explained to us. With regard to the euro or the crisis in the euro area, the reform of EMU, I ask if this is really, is this what we have seen as a solution in the crisis, if this is really confirmation of the Jean Monnet theory, because when I look at this, the reforms are completely unfinished in the euro area. This is still a part, as it is still the area of the European Union, the policy area that needs much more reform. Because what we have is still the problem that we have a common monetary policy and we miss economic and fiscal policy. There is in the treaty, from a legal perspective, I'm a lawyer, only a competence of the Commission to coordinate the member states. But the competence for economic and fiscal policy is fully in the hands of the member states, and this is the origin of the crisis. And we did not solve it. I mean, we had these, we have the European Stability Mechanism, we have the OMT program of the European Central Bank, all this, but this is not the solution of the crisis. It's all interim solutions, let's call it like this. But when I follow the Jean Monnet idea, we should have taken the next leap towards a European economic and fiscal policy, away from coordination to a more binding, because coordination is not binding on the member states, to a more binding policy, maybe with, as proposed, with the European finance minister, something like this, and a euro area budget. But it happened, something very different happened. Because with the NextGenerationEU, we got now a kind of common budget financed by debt, and or mostly financed by debt, but we had no sharing of sovereignty with regard to economic and fiscal policy. So would this be, also from my point of view, this shows that the Jean Monnet narrative script does not fit. One last comment with regard to the treaty reform, the conference on the future of Europe. We don't need it. I would agree with you, because we have all the clauses, we have this kind of passerelle clauses in the treaty to move from unanimity to qualified majority, and this does not need a treaty change. It's all what we need, we have inside of the treaty. Thank you very much.
I think Professor Calais' question is a very good one, but I would answer it in a somewhat different way. So you are, in a way, proceeding from the standard model of optimum currency areas that economists, since Robert Mundell, have relied on, that if you have a monetary union, you need fiscal policy to deal with asymmetric national shocks, but those fiscal policies need to be closely coordinated or centralized. I read what happened in 2008, 2009 in Europe differently. I don't see it as first and foremost having to do with problems with fiscal policy. I see it as having to do first and foremost with problems in the banking system. The problems were that French and German banks lent recklessly, hand over fist, because that's what bankers do. Apologies to any bankers in the audience. And what French and German regulators permitted to the Greek government and other governments that were overborrowing, so that what started in Greece didn't stay in Greece, but rather threatened to destabilize the German and French banking systems. So the lesson I drew from that crisis, and something that I'd written about briefly long before that, back in the early 1990s, was that monetary union without banking union will not work. That if you have these poorly, laxly regulated, interconnected banking systems, that a problem with a country's fiscal policy will infect its neighbors and destabilize financial systems Europe-wide. If you're going to have a monetary union where banks are not deterred from engaging in cross-border lending by exchange rate risk, by exchange rate fluctuations, or capital controls, you need banking regulation at the level of the union that takes those spillovers into account. So I think Jean Monnet's script here, or his neo-functionalist argument, does apply. European policymakers finally figured out and acted upon the correct conclusion that monetary union needed to be accompanied by banking union, and that's what Europe got in 2012. So now if a future Greek government behaves recklessly and overborrows and defaults on its debt, what happens in Greece stays in Greece to a first approximation. And Greece will have to deal with the European Stability Mechanism on the EU's terms and not on its terms. This issue of what to do about fiscal policy in Europe is a difficult one, clearly because there are some cross-border spillovers of fiscal policy that operate through other channels in addition to the banking system. And for reasons people alluded to earlier, there is a real reluctance to delegate additional fiscal prerogatives, national fiscal prerogatives, to the level of the union. So this is a very difficult circle to square. I understand that the European Commission has been working on this revision yet again of the EU's fiscal rules this summer, and its white paper on the subject was supposed to be out by now. So we're holding our breath. Way in the back.
Thanks very much. One of the things that you didn't mention at all, interestingly, is Brexit. And I wonder if it's too soon to tell, or if you could say something about whether there were demonstration effects or lessons or consequences drawn from one country, admittedly not in the Eurozone and so on, but from one country actually making a breakaway. Anyway, I would be interested in hearing what you think about whether or not that was a sufficient crisis to make any difference.
So related to your question, there is a question here from someone watching on Zoom, to quote, with Brexit's shockwave, with what just happened in French parliamentary elections in June, with the recent Swedish election, with what is likely to happen in Italy next week, do you sense a broader political backlash against further integration that will cause a pause, regardless of what theories might drive integration when it is politically feasible? So here we have someone on Zoom suggesting that the Brexit vote will cause other member states to draw back and rethink deeper integration. And the way you posed your question kind of pointed in the opposite.
I would have asked that question
well,
precisely.
it can be asked both ways, but I do think in the same way we learned from the Greek crisis that talking about leaving the monetary union can be destabilizing and costly. Leaving the economic union turns out to be even more costly than economists predicted before the fact. So, my theory of European integration is that by and large it only moves in one direction, and that once you're in the economic or monetary union, you're in it forever. So that's true unless you're British, right? Britain has always been special with one foot in Europe and one foot outside. I don't have a fully developed theory of Brexit or understand well myself how to place Brexit in the context of these different theories. Mark.
I'm Mark Halberg from the Heritage School, and I read some of your other work, Barry, looking specifically at economic institutions, and I would like to maybe try to push you, since I have you here, on some of that work and related to what you presented today. What I'm thinking of in particular is, I think it was your 2007 book, but you've written it in some articles as well, this idea that certain institutions you have domestically might be good institutions or maybe bad institutions given an exogenous shock. So you've talked about technology changes and having co-determination or unions or other sorts of things in European economic history and how these sorts of shocks have had some sort of effect. Clearly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a military challenge, but it's an economic challenge in terms of changes of energy markets, in terms of changes of inflation. I think Germany, particularly the model that Germany has, is very heavy on car production, on chemicals, and other sorts of things. I think there's a real worry here that there needs to be a major change and a shift in the way things are done. So I'd like to ask you to maybe push a bit some of the work that might be more, I would say it's quote unquote domestic, but it has implications for European integration. And going back to Monet and others, when they thought about some of the challenges in the 50s, there's that book about the European, what was it called? The European Rescue of the Nation State. If you remember this book, that's sort of the idea that European integration helped to save a country that was in really dire need. And maybe that country today is Germany. So I'd like to ask you to respond. Thank you.
So my own earlier work on domestic and international institutions was how institutional arrangements, I think you mentioned, Mark, co-determination, but one can think of lots of other examples, were solutions to coordination problems that markets left to their own devices could not solve. So here you have an economist who actually acknowledges that markets don't solve all problems. The argument of that book, to which I still subscribe by and large 15 years later, is that those kind of institutional arrangements are interconnected with one another, deeply embedded in society, and therefore they tend to change only very slowly. So the institutions that Europe displayed after World War II that solved these commitment and coordination problems that had to be solved for Europe to maintain wage moderation and high levels of investment and grow successfully during the golden age of the third quarter of the 20th century, built on political arrangements that had been developed before World War II in the 1920s. So they were deeply embedded and evolved by and large, evolved only very gradually. So when an interpretation of the 1970s is that Europe's circumstances, the circumstances of the advanced countries, changed dramatically with higher energy prices, slower productivity growth, a variety of difficult economic changes, and the institutions did not. And there developed a mismatch between the institutions and the economic problems of the time. So that renders me pessimistic. I detected some pessimism in your question about German economic prospects, given the fact that energy is going to be more expensive going forward, the internal combustion engine is not going to be a popular product, and exporting to China is not going to be a viable growth strategy, as viable as has been the case in the past. Yes.
I was just wondering if you would agree with the statement. Michael Cullen is my name, by the way. I was just wondering if you would agree with the discussion of the Brexit problem, that if the European negotiations had wanted to make leaving the EU more positive than negative, they would have not had such a difficult, they would not have negotiated the way they did. That is, people have learned, the nations of European Union have learned that it is to their disadvantage to leave the EU. Britain is the proof of the pudding, and that if they had made it that Britain would do better by leaving the EU, every other country would have left the EU at the same time.
Well, I think there was no desire on the part of EU negotiators to make Brexit any easier or more comfortable for the UK, because those negotiators valued the cohesion of the European Union, and that cohesion rests in part on the absence of an easy exit option. So I think all that is quite right. They weren't seeking to punish the UK, but they were seeking to maintain the cohesion of the European Union and limit the instability that would have resulted from a world in which it was possible to leave at will without sacrifice or negotiation. So I think I've pretty much exhausted my questions on the Zoom as well. Dan has one.
If you allow just an Outlook question. Damn mask.
So we have one in the front row.
Could you otherwise also present us with a positive outlook, perhaps? Where does European integration, or may it head, given all those national perpetrators that are having their national egoistic motives to block whatever integration comes up?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
Now, perhaps better. Could you provide us perhaps with a positive outlook for European integration forward-looking, given all those national egoistic perpetrators as governments being accountable only to their own nation, national-wise, and not to any other nation within Europe? So how could Europe eventually, potentially, at all move forward? All those topics that you described and analyzed very detailed and very thoroughly lack the vision, perhaps, of how to overcome those national sovereignty issues. This is my statement, at least. Do you see a potential of how potentially European nations, even if it's only a minority of such, could move forward?
So I'm not here necessarily to give you either a positive or a negative vision of all North American-based economists who could conceivably be here tonight. I think I am probably the most optimistic about the European project, and I am optimistic about it. I think when you talk about the euro, for example, you have to consider the alternatives. And when you put it in that context, the euro has been a great positive for Europe. I think about the financial chaos Europe would have suffered in 2008, 2009 if it had still had a dozen or two national currencies. So in terms of vision, I think it's necessary to articulate the advantages of common European policies in specific domains, where in my talk and in my mind, I would emphasize foreign and security policy, given the current conjuncture.
Well, that's a good setup for my somewhat incoherent question, which is, yes, you would think that the current situation would be an effective prod towards a quantum leap of some dimensions towards more effective foreign and security policies. But the great break in some ways on that is that to the extent there is a successful a success story to be described here, maybe it's more a success story of NATO than it is of a failure of the EU, which has never really been able to distinguish itself in the, particularly in the security realm. So short of having a crisis in Taiwan that forces the U.S. to reorient its attention, how do we get that that more effective foreign and security policy, qualified majority voting, and actual sustained expenditure and coordination in foreign and security policy in the EU?
So I don't have a good answer to that question. There will be other foreign and security issues that need to be addressed in Europe's neighborhood. It's not clear that the United States, in all possible future worlds, will be invested in solving those problems. So I simply don't want to think about a second Trump term. But such an event can't be ruled out, in which case NATO can't be ruled in.
So my name is Elke from Berlin School of Economics and Law, and I just want to add a question to your remarks about the EU Next Generation, the 750 plus 100 billion euro for the SURE bonds. You know, this package was refinanced by international markets very successfully. And I wonder, how is the EU able to refinance 750, which is left to be financed in this year or next period? How could it be possible? I am optimistic that it will be possible to refinance the EU Next Generation program. And I would like to ask you, do you see any rule for the ECB to support this procedure by refinancing the necessity of EU Next Generation bonds? I mean, we have no treasury, we have no treasury on the fiscal side, and we have always the problem that the European Monetary Union has not the same level of credibility according to its feasibility to create debt to international markets, because the EU, the Monetary Union, is in the great international comparison with the United States, Treasury, Federal Reserve Bank, Canada, Japanese, and so on. So do you think, according to your paper you wrote with Daniel Gross, do you think the ECB could have a stronger position to do this, to refinance these bonds?
I have not studied this aspect of Next Generation EU closely, but my understanding, my impression is that there is no problem here, that the member states have agreed to transfer resources sufficient to pay the interest on those bonds into the indefinite future. They are the joint and several obligations of all the member states. They are AAA rated. They're not the kind of subprime securities that a central bank might have to step in and backstop. So the ECB's problem is not Next Generation EU, it's Italy, of course. Microphone is coming, I think.
Thank you. We were talking now mainly about economic and monetary policy. Would your approach, based on integration theories and scripts, apply also for political integration? Let's think about the rule of law problem we have in the European Union, especially with Hungary and Poland. Think of the migration, the unsolved migration challenge we face in the European Union. There we have the freedom of citizens in the European Union, cross-border freedom. But what we don't have is really a common migration and asylum policy, and which is a big challenge. So my question would be, how would you apply your theoretical approach to this? Does it work as well? Thanks.
So these are difficult issues. It's tempting to say we don't have a common migration and asylum policy in the United States. That, one of the ways of thinking about economic integration is that there are efficiency advantages from centralization and harmonization of policies, but there are disadvantages when there are very different preferences over those policies in different regions or in different member states. So we face that dilemma in my country, and I think this is true in Europe, of course, when it comes to social policy, policy toward immigration, fiscal policy, which you raised before as well. So again, the question becomes, in what domain are those preferences likely to converge, given the shocks and pressures that Europe will face going forward?
take advantage of my being here to ask you a question. Institutional change takes a lot of time, and you've given us a lot of reasons why that is so. So in this process of moving towards ever closer union, and I do think that that is the intention in Europe, are there any lessons from other federations in their formation? I'm thinking specifically of, say, Australia or Canada, amazingly recently federated 150 years ago, and Jean Monnet is 70 years ago, about how long these processes take, and essentially, are we looking through Europe with an ahistorical lens and assuming things can happen faster than they can? Or do these processes just take time? Is there evidence on this from formation of federations elsewhere?
So each national case is different. The one I know best is the United States, for obvious reasons, where it took a very long time. It was punctuated by a civil war, where a national banking and financial system emerged, a uniform currency emerged only a century after the creation of the United States of America. So that's a reminder that these are typically very lengthy processes, and that the European Union has moved a long way in its 70 years of existence.
Thank you. Do you want to say any last words before we close for the evening?
Only thank you to the audience online as well as the audience in the room.
And thank you, Barry, for a wonderful evening.